I'm pissed off. I'm past angry. It's time to do something about it, and we have to do something about it now. My patience, I have none anymore. I'm too old to have patience. It's important that we solve these issues and we solve them quickly. We have the ability, let's do it now. CRA can end this if used properly, and most importantly, with everyone's investment. This is a team game. Team means to me is I can't do it without you, and you can't do it without me. So we have to work together in order to make change, and we do it now with ideas as well as innovation. So I want to bring up the king of ideas and the king of innovation. Jesse Van Tol is the NCRC's president and CEO. He has been the NCRC since 2006 and has held a variety of leadership positions, eventually becoming chief executive in 2018. His work championing fair and responsible banking has resulted in nearly $300 billion in investments in low and moderate income communities throughout the community, through community benefits agreements with banking institutions. We have been a great part of those CBAs. With his leadership, NCRC has grown today as an organization with assets of nearly $150 million and an budget of $35 million. Jesse is a popular speaker and lecturer and has testified before Congress and appeared on NPR, in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Politico, among other outlets. He also sits on a variety of advisory boards, including the Federal Reserve Board's Consumer Advisory Council, Fannie and Freddie Mac's Affordable Housing Advisory Councils, and he is a member of the Consumer Advisory Council of Bank of America, JPMorgan Chase, TRUIST, Fifth Third, Huntington National Bank, First Horizon Bank, KeyBank, Quicken Loans, Santander, and numerous others. Jesse is also a senior fellow with Humanity in Action and an International Human Rights Group and a Communications Institute fellow with Opportunity Agenda. Jesse received his bachelor's degree in history and his international studies degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and received an executive education certificate from the Harvard Kennedy School as part of the NeighborWorks Achieving Excellence. Also, just recently had a birthday. You turned 40, right? All of that just turned 40. I give you Jesse Van Tol, CEO of NCRC.
Well, Cornell said everything I have to say, so a round of applause for Cornell, everybody. So I'm just going to use this podium mic here. Well, I have good news and bad news. You know, I've been coming to South Florida for long enough. In fact, over a decade ago, I started coming to South Florida as NCRC's director of organizing, working with Arden and then Cornell and others to help organize a coalition here, which you now know as the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida. And but the first few events we did, they said, listen, it's South Florida. People could be as much as 2 hours late. And in fact, I have a story about this. In 2018, I spoke at this event, and I spoke at lunch, and my flight was at like 4 p.m. Out of Miami, and it was about 12:31 p.m. I said, okay, I should get going, you know, but I have plenty of time. And I get in my rental car, and I'm driving down 95, and someone got shot on 95, and they closed it down. It was a murder scene. I had to go around. Then it started monsooning. I had to pull over, drive a little bit, pull over. I finally get it to the airport, return the rental car, gate D80, the bus gate, all the way at the end. I'm running, I'm red in the face. I pull up, the bus just left 3 minutes before. So I know something about South Florida traffic. And this year I thought, well, I'll do something different then. If they're going to be 2 hours late, I'm going to give the speech 2 hours early. So at 7 this morning, I actually came up here and gave the speech. So the good news is you don't have to listen to it. I already did it. And I want to tell you something. It was a great speech. I gave myself a standing ovation. You could hear every word perfectly clear as I stood at this podium at 7 o'clock this morning. I have to thank Arden and Cornell for their leadership, not just here in South Florida over the years, but also on our board, 2 of our board members who have been very important to our work in evolution, the growth of our membership here and around the country. We're grateful for them. You've got 2 great leaders. All of the people I have come to know here in this community who are part of the Community Reinvestment Alliance. We're so grateful to be in partnership with you. So if the good news was I already gave the speech, the bad news is in the actual speech you're about to hear. So my speech writing process is first you write it up here, and then I sit down, I write about half the speech, 3/4 of the speech. And then I show up at the event and I talk to people and you get little tidbits and you can tailor your speech. And so last night I'm talking to people, they just think I'm making conversation. I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. Oh yeah, I agree. That's a good line. But when I sat down to finish the speech this morning at 6:30, my wife called, family emergency. So you have a 3/4 speech. Hopefully that means it's 3/4 as long, but I'm already taking up time, so we'll see. And some of it will be off the cuff. This is all steak, no filler, all gas, no brakes. As my son would say, it's all facts, no cap. You're getting the unfiltered, just the core of it today. So I want to start with an idea. And the idea is this, it's not an original one, someone else said it. And the idea is this, every system is perfectly designed to produce the outcome it produces. And I want to say that again, maybe some of you have heard it before. Every system is perfectly designed to produce the outcome that it produces. And when you hear people talk about how the system is broken, it starts with the belief that the system would work for everybody, but for the fact that there's a flaw in it. And in fact, in my experience, it's the opposite. That the system is not producing good outcomes for everybody, and that is by design. In fact, it's a feature and not a bug. That the system depends on not everybody doing well. Exclusion, exploitation, these are not accidental byproducts of a broken system. They are intentional results of a system. It's, if you think of the economy, and I've never quite put it this way before, but the economy is sort of like a giant pyramid scheme. The wealth of the very few people at the top is supported by the labor, the work of the many people at the bottom. System is perfectly designed to produce the outcome that it is producing. So when we think about our country's legacy of racism, of slavery, the ownership and control of people, if you think about the world's history in this regard, do we really believe that groups of people innately, naturally, from their birth, from their very beginnings, hated each other, were at odds, attempted to discredit, diminish, dehumanize other groups of people just because? Do we think that the country accepted immigrants, dehumanized them simply because culturally we didn't like people from other places? Or do we believe that if we go back thousands of years, that some people saw profit in exploiting and taking advantage of other people, in controlling other people for their labor? The dehumanization happened later as a consequence of when you put other people into slavery, when you take advantage of other people, I firmly believe that's not a natural human instinct. And when it happens, you have to justify to yourself why you did that, why you should be allowed to do that. And you can trace throughout history different ideas, different strains of thought that fundamentally began with the control and exploitation of a group of people that was then justified in lots of different ways, sometimes on religious grounds, sometimes on economic grounds explicitly. And we see over the course of our history a ever refined version of this, an increasingly sophisticated, less overt version of this. When control of people became illegal, when we outlawed slavery in this country, it became about control of the land, of places. You see Jim Crow laws in the South. When control of the land became illegal, it became about controlling the means of buying the land, of capital. That was redlining. That was racial discrimination and the provision of credit. And when that became illegal, thanks to, among other laws, the Community Reinvestment Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Fair Housing Act, the way in which that control was exercised continued to evolve. The wealth of the few depended on the poverty of the many. And you can see this very clearly in labor markets, that cheap labor, many companies, indeed whole industries are relying upon, dependent upon having sources of very cheap labor to produce the great wealth that they produce for their management, for their owners, for the very few. But I want to give you a more complicated version of how this works. We know in this country that we have an affordable housing supply crisis, that the cost of housing has become so great. And fundamentally, there's a supply and demand imbalance. You would expect in a perfectly free market that when demand goes up or if demand stays steady, that the market produces enough supply to meet the need. Except that in the case of housing supply, we have again a situation where the wealth of the few is supported by the poverty of the many. What happens when you constrict housing supply? Anybody know? Economics 101. The value goes up. When the value goes up, who becomes wealthy? The people who already own their homes. And while this group of people as a class may or may not know or even intentionally be attempting to exclude others from home ownership, they sure vote that way. Where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, we have tried time and time again to increase the supply of housing. We have attempted to change local laws, some of which were well-intended when they were put in place. Others seem to have been aimed at NIMBYism in the first place, not in my backyard. We've attempted to deconstruct these laws. In one of the most progressive counties in the country, we have a Democratic socialist as county executive. The voting bloc isn't there to increase housing supply. Why? Because the many middle-class people who live in Montgomery County, Maryland, it's one of the wealthiest counties in the country. And by the way, that includes me. I'm a homeowner in Montgomery County, Maryland. Votes time and time again to block the production of more housing. Because when you reduce supply and demand stays steady, the value goes up. And that means every one of us The year I bought my home, the value of my home went up 30% in a single year. You know what that means for me and my family in terms of our wealth? It means a lot. And so whether people are actively conspiring or intentionally excluding, fundamentally, the wealth of the few, the homeowners, the people who managed to become homeowners in Montgomery County, Maryland, is supported by the fact that other people cannot buy. It's supported by exclusion, in some cases, very intentional exclusion. And we can see this time and time again in our economy. That when we look at exclusion, when we look at constriction, when we look at discrimination, that these things are not a byproduct, an accident, a broken system. These are, in fact, features, not a bug. Every system is perfectly designed to produce the outcomes it produces. And in our economic system, wealth tends to accumulate to those who have wealth, and power tends to accumulate to those who have wealth. Those homeowners in Montgomery County express a lot of power politically, locally. And that power over time creates the ability to generate more wealth. It continues to exacerbate wealth inequality. And that wealth inequality continues to exacerbate a power inequality in my neighborhood, in my state, in our region, and in the country. And this dynamic plays out at every rung of the economic ladder. You can think about this as not just the wealthy versus the non-wealthy. You can think about this as billionaires versus all of us. You can think about this as millionaires versus the middle class, homeowners versus renters. At every rung of the economic ladder, this dynamic plays out. That the wealth of the people higher up in the ladder is actually, in many cases, created by those below. What does this mean? Why is it important? I fundamentally believe that our challenge in the way that we think about our economic system is this fact. Is this fact that when we, for hundreds, thousands of years, allowed people through coercion, through the use of physical power, slavery, other forms of maintaining power over other people, created wealth inequality. And that wealth inequality created power inequality. And that power inequality continues to be expressed even as we have outlawed some of the acts and practices that were more overt. Slavery, control of people, prohibition of owning land. These types of laws that were allowed as recently as 50 years ago. 60 years ago. And so this power dynamic is what we need to address. Now, what does this have to do with CRA? Cornell and Arden are like, I thought we were going to talk about CRA. Sorry. What's CRA really about? CRA was passed in response to redlining, one of those practices that I mentioned, the control of credit. And it was a law that said that banks had an affirmative obligation to serve the convenience and needs of the communities in which they're based. And that concept's actually really rare in law. There are a lot of laws that basically say, hey, you can't do bad things to somebody. You can't sell them a toaster that's going to explode into flames when they use it. That's a consumer protection, consumer safety issue. So there's a law that, says, well, if you produce a consumer product that has flaws, that's, you got to pay them back, you can get fined, all this stuff. There's a lot of laws that says you can't do bad things. CRA is somewhat rare in two features. It's a law that says you must do good things. You have to serve the convenience and needs of the communities. It's an affirmative obligation to invest in things like affordable housing, small business, to serve the community. And the second thing that CRA did and does today is in setting up the framework around serving the convenience and needs of the community, it inherently created power for the community to have a say about what that looks like. And indeed, much of the policy struggle and the practical struggle around the way that CRA works is a tension. Banks will naturally want to attempt to define what the convenience and needs of the community are. They will want to find the things that can be deemed regulatorily acceptable as serving the convenience and needs of the community that are the most profitable and the easiest to do at volume. And they're motivated to do so. They want to pass their CRA exams. It's a regulatory obligation. And yet the law says the convenience and needs of the community. And guess who will always have the ability to define what those needs are? People in the community themselves. And so CRA is rare for being an affirmative obligation, and it's rare for creating this tension between the profit model of a profit-driven institution and then what they must do in community to solve problems. And in fact, it sets up a mutual problem-solving framework. Community says this is a need, this is a problem. And the bank's got to try to find ways to solve that problem. But CRA doesn't work automatically. There are the things banks will do to fulfill the regulatory obligation, and that will happen whether you're engaged or not. But CRA really works when you do, because CRA does give you power, gives community organizations the ability to say, well, wait a minute, here's what the community needs are, and how is a bank fulfilling that community need? And in creating that tension that a bank must resolve, what banks do, well, they build teams of people who are in charge of doing these activities. Teams of people, many of whom are here today, CRA officers, who have to create relationships with the communities, who have to listen, who have to be responsive, who have to ascertain and determine what are the community needs, and then who have to develop strategies to solve those things. CRA works at its best when you do, when you raise those community needs. And the way to raise those community needs in the most powerful way is to create that power, is to do it together, is to work together in coalition. And that idea is fundamentally what the National Community Reinvestment Coalition is all about. It's fundamentally what the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida is all about, is this notion that when we can create a more powerful conversation about what the convenience and needs in a community are, we can create a more powerful conversation, a more powerful incentive inside of a bank. We can empower the people inside of the bank who want to do the very things that we're concerned about, who see along with us the problems that we are facing. And that is fundamentally the core concept within CRA, the power that it gives. Now, there are a lot of technical things about the way CRA works. Today, it establishes 3 exams, a lending exam, an investment exam, and a services exam, tests. And banks get evaluated every 3 to 5 years. The examiners come in and they say, well, what did you do? How well did you do at lending? And how well did you do with your investments and services? Have to measure and track. And within that process, there's again power to community groups. A comment letter on a CRA exam can go a long way. An example of a promising practice or program that is particularly responsive to community needs can help a bank pass its CRA exam. But CRA works when you do. If you do nothing, banks will buy mortgage-backed securities, will engage in tax credit markets, LIHTC, new markets, tax credits. And these are good things, but they may or may not be responsive to the evolving community needs that you see. The new CRA rule corrects for a number of problems within the CRA framework that were in some cases present from the beginning, and in other cases are a consequence of the evolution of banking. And so CRA, when it was set up, looked at where banks have branches. It established assessment areas in those places where banks had a physical footprint. And yet we know that banking has evolved. First of all, it used to be illegal for banks interstate banking was illegal. Banks were chartered in each and every state to do business in that place. We did away with that. The advent of the internet changed banking completely and continues to change banking. More and more people are doing their banking online, getting a mortgage or a small business loan online. And so CRA needed to evolve. Today, it is perfectly possible for a bank, because of the incentive structure built within CRA, to lend equitably where it has branches and where it gets assessed under CRA, and inequitably everywhere else. Because banks don't get examined and analyzed and evaluated everywhere they do business. They just get evaluated where they have branches. And so those internet banks that have no branches get evaluated where they're headquartered, often in places like Salt Lake City or Wilmington, Delaware. Those banks that are branch light, they have branches in some places, but they have national business models. You can think of a Citibank or a Capital One has some branches in some places, does lending on a nationwide basis. These are large institutions. Those institutions have less of a CRA obligation. It is perfectly possible for them to lend equitably in certain places and inequitably everywhere else. And that is the core of what the new CRA rule is attempting to address. For the first time in the history of CRA, banks will be assessed everywhere they do business, thanks to the new retail lending assessment areas, which establishes assessment areas where banks are doing a certain number of loans. And thanks to what's called the outside retail lending assessment areas, which will establish an assessment everywhere else. An important corrective to CRA, to the way CRA works. The rule also does a number of things that were necessary correctives to the way that CRA worked or didn't work in certain communities. In the creation of new impact factors and new definitions for community development, CRA will motivate investments and loans under CRA made by banks pursuant to their CRA obligations in places that today are CRA deserts. There's an impact factor within the new CRA for making loans in places that receive relatively little capital. Newly qualified are places like native lands where there are very few branches. Investments in CDFIs automatically qualified. Those activities that are responsive specifically to low-income people, because CRA is low and moderate income. And a common critique has been that banks will cream the crop and lend to the most upper income limit of moderate income. Those activities that are specifically targeted to low-income people will qualify. New categories of community development activity, those community supportive services, bringing in things like healthcare, education, childcare services. These kinds of things come into the rubric of CRA in a new way. And well, the rule is not a wholesale change, it's an evolution. And in some ways, it's a modest one. It was a compromise. It does some significant and powerful things. There are things it doesn't do. It doesn't correct the original sin of CRA, which is that CRA, though it was response to redlining, which was race discrimination, was passed on the basis of income. It speaks to low and moderate income people. And the regulators did not make race a more explicit consideration within CRA. They were afraid of a court challenge, given the Supreme Court that we have today, the attacks on racial equity and DEI. But it's a significant and missed opportunity that we need to continue to work to address. Let me close out here. I mentioned CRA works with UDO. You're going to hear a conversation later on with our friends at TRUIST, Anthony Weekly, about one of the community benefits agreements that we reached. We created community benefits agreements to effectuate the model of what I'm talking about, that CRA works when you do. That when you can create a more powerful conversation with banking institutions, you can change the incentives inside of a bank. You can bring them to the table to be more responsive to community needs. And CBAs are an example of how we've done that. Hundreds of billions of dollars of commitments, but those are big numbers and they're difficult to understand. And so I hope you will pay attention later on to Anthony when he talks about some of the things that TRUIST has done as a consequence of the CBA, gives that opportunity. But a few examples. One bank that we did a CBA with agreed to double mortgage lending to low and moderate income people as a consequence of the CBA. Another agreed to lend to people of color at rates equaling their demographic representation in the community, something that almost no bank is doing today. One bank expanded its philanthropy by nearly $90 million. That was a 100% increase, a doubling of what they were doing philanthropically. And lots of other examples that I hope Anthony will talk about. And most importantly, these agreements establish a different kind of relationship that is aimed at creating this tension between what an institution will do to make money, to fulfill the needs of its shareholders, of its management, and what those convenience and needs are in the community. So when we think about CRA, we think about being persistent and insistent, that we are in a battle to undo hundreds, thousands of years of structural inequality, that CRA is a powerful tool to think about bringing into tension those problems and those needs that we have in community to achieve a broader measure of shared prosperity, to achieve a broader measure of inclusion, to address those things that work within our system to exclude and to reverse those and to think about how we include more people, how more people become owners, how they share in the prosperity of this great country. Because fundamentally, right now, the system works to exclude people, and that's not an accident or a mistake. One of the things I didn't do was write a great concluding line. That was the one quarter of the speech that I didn't get to this morning. So let me close just by saying this without repeating myself. The moral arc of the universe may bend towards justice. That may be perfectly true, but it's not automatic, and you cannot take it for granted. It is a consequence of leadership. It happens because people decide to make it happen. And in your everyday actions, you have agency, you have the power to bend the arc of the universe more towards justice in your actions. And quite often we think about leadership just as a function of what you say, how you stand up. Leadership is what I'm doing right now. Get up in front of a group of people and tell them how they ought to think about things. But often leadership is, in fact, not just how you are in front of other people, how you lead the way, but leadership is often about how you follow other people. Because in fact, no leader is a leader without other people who agree with them. And so leadership is actually fundamentally about relationships, about working with other people. And sometimes that does not mean being out in front. Sometimes that means being the first person to say, I agree, when someone else says something that's powerful and important. And this is very difficult to do. We are incented in our lives, in the nonprofits that we run, to compete. Martin Luther King said in his speech in Memphis that whenever Pharaoh feared an uprising of the slaves in Egypt, he had a favorite recipe to prolong slavery, to keep the system that he had created going. And that recipe was to keep the slaves fighting amongst themselves. The pitting of one group of people against another. And it doesn't just happen in terms of race, and it doesn't just happen in terms of gender or class. It happens at every rung of the economic ladder. It happens with every group of people. Nonprofit executives are incented to compete against each other. Every one of you has probably experienced the person you thought who was your partner. And then when resources were on the line, they stabbed you in the back. And that's not leadership. Great leadership requires great followership too. It requires people to work together. And one way of doing that is to work together in coalition, which is what brings you all together here today. So I'll close on that note and thank you. And you're not done hearing from me. I think I have to stay up here. So thank you so much.